You are listening to part 4 of our 20-part series, Marvelous Mints, The Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan. Welcome to Time Monk Radio.
Hi, Gemini. How are you this week?
I am wonderful. How are you?
Oh, just fine. I called my brother up and asked him for some rosemary.
Okay.
He lives in Oregon, and he runs a small organic farm there.
Oh,
and
okay.
his weather just enough milder than he can let his rosemary overwinter.
Nice.
Mine will not overwinter. As a matter of fact, I was just at an herbal conference the middle of September, and was talking to an herbal gardener there, someone who grows like acres of herbs, just really loves supplying people with herbs. And I said to her, so what's the trick of keeping the rosemary over the winter? And she said, don't try. I said, what? She says, I cut my rosemary right down to the roots this time of the year, and I just make stuff with it. I I dry it for tea. I dry it for use in meat dishes, and we love rosemary with salmon. That's one of our favorites. That's why I called my brother, send more rosemary. We're out of rosemary to have with our salmon. I should have said send more salmon too, right?
Right.
So she makes rosemary honey, and she dries rosemary for rosemary tea, and she makes rosemary vinegar, and she just says, that's it. And then next year I plant new rosemarys.
Oh, okay. Yeah, ours didn't winter well either, and normally it does, but we had such a harsh winter, I had to replant it this year.
Exactly. So I thought, wow, a professional gardener doesn't even try to overwinter her rosemary. All right. Because I'm always, like bringing mine inside, and it's so light sensitive. It's just like, it really is so miserably unhappy if it doesn't get enough light. Well, we talked about rosemary loves, its homeland, the Mediterranean area, where it's bright and sunny and hot, warming and drying. That's rosemary, right?
Yes, definitely.
So what's your favorite way to use rosemary?
I actually like it on fish as well. I will use it on salmon. I like it on ahi tuna. I do make tea out of it, and occasionally we'll use it as a hair rinse. I like rosemary just about on anything. And we like to take like Marcona almonds and saute them with a little bit of rosemary as well.
Oh, that sounds wickedly good.
It is so good.
Oh, my goodness. Somebody just gave me, rosemary potato chips.
Ooh, that sounds interesting.
This is unfair. These chips should not taste this good. And, of course, the package says, loaded with antioxidants, which is true, right? Because all of the aromatic mints are pretty high in antioxidants. And as we found, science has established that rosemary is really rich in antioxidants. And the herb that we're going to talk about tonight, sage, is also incredibly rich in antioxidants. The thing that always comes to my mind when I think about sage is a saying. And the saying is, contra vim mortis crescit salvia in hortis, cor moriator homo, qui salvia crescit in hortis. And let me translate, because I'm sure you do not speak Latin, and I need the translation too, although long ago, when I was much, much younger, I did take a lot of Latin. And so it means, it's a little more meaningful to me. Contra vim mortis, against the power of death, crescit salvia in hortis, sage grows in your garden. Cor moriator homo, qui salvia crescit in hortis. Why would man die when sage grows in the garden? Sage is the savior. It is salvia. Salvia officinalis. Last week we had Rosmarinus officinalis, and this week Salvia officinalis. Listen for that officinalis. When Linnaeus was naming the plants, any plant that was already being used medicinally got a species name of officinalis. So we have here not parsley, but parsley, sage, rosemary, and we'll get to thyme. Parsley, of course, is in a different family. But of those 4 herbs, parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, 3 are aromatic mints. And we looked a lot at rosemary last week. If you weren't with us, go back and catch it. It's been archived. And this week, we're going to delve into sage, the savior that grows in your garden. I mentioned in our introductory talk at the beginning of this month that there are 500 different species of sage, and that I went to a garden where they had 400 different kinds of sage, and they didn't even have 400 different species because they had a lot of different breeds of sage. And then in the second week of our series, where we were talking about the language of the flowers and the language of mints, blue salvia and red salvia had different kinds of things that they meant if we actually gave them to someone. If we gave blue salvia to someone, I think of you. And if we gave red salvia, I am forever thine. And these are not different species. These are merely different breeds, the same plant that we've simply bred to have different colored flowers. Some of the sages that are frequently grown in the garden include garden sage, beer garden sage, broadleaf sage, Dalmatian sage, red sage, and kitchen sage. And these are actually all different species of sage. I've also grown a Salvia officinalis, which is usually called garden sage, in a variegated leaf, so that the leaf, instead of being like a fuzzy kind of grayish green, was splotched with yellow and lighter green patches, and also a purple-leafed garden sage, where the round kind of nubby leaf is a purplish in color. Many people, when we start talking about sage, kind of immediately think of sagebrush. But sagebrush isn't actually sage at all. Sagebrush is Artemisia tridentata. It's in the Asteraceae family, not in the Lamiaceae family. It's not a mint. It's in a totally different family. So we're talking about, again, plants in the mint family which usually don't get very big. For many of us in the Northeast who grow sage, sage is a kind of half-hardy plant. Get a really bad winter, the sage will die, and it's not really strongly perennial either. I found that if I leave my sage in the same place for more than 3 years, it will really die back and maybe even disappear. But if I dig it up every 2 years and move it around, I can get a few more years out of it. But I think I'm going to take Lillian's advice and maybe just, say, hey, that was it. It was a great year, Sage. Really enjoyed you, and we'll start again next year. Because sage does grow very well, and it grows very well for almost all people. Sage is a great starter plant for people like the rosemary. It's native to the Mediterranean area, so it can take just about anything except overwatering. Forget to water it, it's fine. Put it in a location that's too sunny. It does not know what too sunny is at all. Sage is a plant that so loves the Mediterranean that most of the world's supply of sage is harvested along the Adriatic coast, which is that little arm of the Mediterranean that reaches up behind the boot of Italy there. Sage is grown commercially in the U.S., Canada, Argentina, Germany, and France, but just in certain places, although you will really enjoy growing some sage. The original reference that I looked at said that there were 500 different species of sage, but then another reference says that there are 900 species in the genus Salvia. And I thought, that's a big difference. That's almost twice as many. I'm no expert in taxonomy, but it kind of goes along with what I've been saying all along. There's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of different sages and lots and lots and lots of different mints. And if they're different species or different breeds, that can sometimes be hard to tell. Rosemaries are all aromatic, even if they are ornamental, but that's not true of the sages. There are aromatic sages and there are non-aromatic sages, and usually the ornamental sages don't have a smell. One of the most interesting of the sages is chia. Are you shocked? I was when I discovered that chia is a form of sage. And of course, the seeds of chia are well known for making chia seed pets as well as medicinally as a laxative. Salvia officinalis, your regular garden sage, was used medicinally throughout the ancient world by the ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, and the ancient Romans. The Egyptians used it primarily as a fertility agent. Isn't that interesting? We think of sage nowadays as something that dries things up, and so I wouldn't necessarily think of it as a fertility agent, but did we say that those volatile oils have estrogenic properties? Yes, we did, and sage, especially the garden sage, is loaded with volatile oils, so that's probably what's going on there in terms of it being for fertility. To the Romans, sage was a sacred herb, and there was always an enormous ceremony that was associated with the harvesting of the sage. That indeed, salvere in Latin means to be saved. Why die when the Savior grows in your garden? Sage has long been associated with longevity and used as a cure for a huge variety of ailments. Can you tell me which ones? You're right. Digestive system ailments? Yes. You're right. Respiratory system ailments? Yes. You're right. Nerve tonic? Yes, you're absolutely right. As an antiseptic, as a way to help get rid of contagion. Here's a modern contagion that sage offers an enormous amount of help with. Alzheimer's disease affects 1 in 10 people over 65 and half of the people over 80. The number of people with Alzheimer's has doubled in the past 40 years, partly because our life expectancy has gotten longer. Sage offers us hope. In the 16th century, the English herbalist Gerard wrote, "Sage is for the head and the brain, and quickeneth the memory." Following this historical hint, numerous studies were done testing sage's ability to prevent and treat Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's prevention seems to be linked to a diet high in antioxidants and the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which guard against low levels of neurotransmitter acetylcholine that leads to loss of brain functioning in Alzheimer's. The drug treatment usually focuses on inhibiting the ACH enzyme, and in vitro tests show that both Salvia officinalis and Salvia lavendulifolia have ACH inhibiting compounds. Unfortunately, Salvia officinalis has fairly high levels of the neurotoxin thuyon. We talked about thuyon before, that monoterpene, making Salvia lavendulifolia best for treatment of those with Alzheimer's. The inhibition of ACH was confirmed in rats. Now, a rigorous study of sage's effects on humans shows enormous process for the ability of sage's antioxidants and ACH inhibitors to help our brain. So it's not only rosemary that's for remembrance, it's sage to keep yourself wise. Thank you so much, sage. The Greeks are extremely particular as to the time and the manner in which they collect sage. They suggest that the very best time to collect it is May 1st before sunrise. Now, You got to be around the Mediterranean to do that. You live here in the northeast part of the United States, where my brother farms, in the Pacific Northwest. You're not gathering sage in May. You're gathering sage in September or even October. There's a reason that sage is associated with turkey stuffing, because it's when we are bringing it in. In modern herbal medicine, sage is used in Asia to treat hemorrhoids, blood in the urine, fluid in the abdomen, insomnia, and hepatitis. In Germany, sage tea is drunk whenever anyone has a cold, a congestion, or a fever. And in the U.S., sage is used to treat hot flashes, night sweats, estrogen loss, and as a tonic for those who are dealing with fatigue and nervous exhaustion. American herbalists also think of sage as a way to enhance immunity and improve mental functioning. Midwives and women who work with women think of sage first and foremost as drying. And I mean drying. We talked about rosemary being warming and drying, but sage is the most drying of all the herbs, and certainly the most drying of any of the mints. Women have found that drinking even half a cup of very strong sage tea or sage infusion can slow down and dry up their lactation. Sometimes things come up where a woman needs to be separated from her child who has been nursing well, but is at an age where she or he can be weaned, and it can be difficult in that situation for the mother to leave, but taking sage can dry that breast milk up. It very effectively dries up underarm perspiration. As a matter of fact, one wit suggested that sage was like the herbal Botox, because Botox is also used to decrease sweating. I've known people to spray sage on their skin if they feel that they sweat too profusely. It is, of course, antiseptic and antibacterial, so it makes a great underarm spray instead of a deodorant. And many deodorants, unfortunately, are based on aluminum compounds, especially when those aluminum compounds are spread on the shaved underarm area of a woman. They have not a lot of problem of getting to the brain. And speaking of Alzheimer's, we do think that there might be a connection between aluminum in the brain and Alzheimer's. So let's drink some sage tea to help prevent Alzheimer's, and let's stop using deodorant and use some sage vinegar or some sage tincture sprayed in the underarm area to also help prevent Alzheimer's. According to Germany's Commission E, sage has been proven to be antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral, and astringent. Human studies using sage to treat herpes have shown reduction in the size, number, severity, and time between outbreaks in both genital and oral cold sores. Wow. In fact, sage has been known to treat any soreness in the mouth or the throat. One of the things that I'm doing right now is harvesting my sage, chopping it up, putting it in a jar, and pouring yummy honey all over it. It's kind of hard to get the honey down into the herb. You kind of have to poke it with the stick, because you put a lot of sage down in there, and sage can get a little woody like the rosemary. And it's kind of chopped up, and you're poking, pouring honey, and poking. But you get the jar really filled up with honey and really got a lot of sage in there. And then you put a lid on it, and you label it. Well, I do. That's what I'm doing. And then in wintertime, if I wake up, I got that kind of soreness in the back of my throat. Wow. I'm on it. I stick my spoon in my sage honey, I plop a big spoon of that sage honey, and it's the sage and the honey together right into my teacup. Pour boiling water in there, put the lid on it to keep those volatile oils in. Wait, just till it cools enough to drink, however long that is. 5-6 minutes, it's enough. And then I drink that sage tea down. It goes right into the mucous surfaces of the throat and the mouth, and is so amazing to kill any bacteria that are lurking there. No wonder sage is a longevity tonic. A gargle of sage made with sage vinegar and hot water has been used for even very severe things going on in the throat. Culpepper is a big fan of sage. He says it's good for diseases of the liver and to make blood. It provoketh the urine and causes the hair to become black. It stayeth the bleeding of wounds and cleans ulcers and sores. 3 spoonsful of the juice of sage, taking fasting with a little honey, will arrest the spitting or vomiting of blood in consumption. It is profitable for all pains in the head, especially cold humors, and for all pains in the joints, whether inward or outward. The juice of sage in warm water cureth hoarseness and cough, and Pliny saith it will cure even the sting and bite of a serpent. Sage is of excellent use to help the memory. It warms and quickens the senses. Make a gargle with sage, rosemary, and plantain boiled in wine, and wash the mouth and throat as need be. You begin to see why I have grouped rosemary and sage together. Not just because I know that you already use them, know them, and love them, but because they are remarkably similar. We were talking about the ACH inhibitor and says, well, it turns out that rosemary has that exact same ACH inhibitor. Not a lot of them in stew, but both sage and rosemary too. These are, in a way, very sister plants, and we have found an ACH inhibitor in ginkgo as well. What else can we say about sage? I didn't talk very much about culinary uses of rosemary, so let's talk some about the culinary uses of sage, because, again, this is one place where sage and rosemary are quite similar in their uses. And that is that the antioxidant, antibacterial, antifungal, and antimicrobial effects of the volatile oils, including thulium, found in both rosemary and sage, are really difficult on food-borne diseases. In days when people did not have refrigeration, when they did not have electricity to run the refrigerators that we now have, food spoilage was a very big issue. When we walk into the supermarket, we are used to seeing the dairy items in a refrigerated case. We are used to seeing the meat in a refrigerated case. We are used to seeing these foods that we think of as perishable refrigerated, but this is not true from most of the history of humanity. Interestingly enough, we have found the carcass of a woolly mammoth submerged in a lake with pieces hacked off it. And it looked like the hunters obviously could not eat all of the woolly mammoth at once, and so carved off some delectable pieces from the woolly mammoth and then threw it into a lake which they knew was about to freeze to preserve their woolly mammoths until the spring when they could eat some more of it. So perhaps we're not so hoity-toity after all with our freezers on our refrigerators. Perhaps our ancestors had some interesting ideas about how to do that too. He that would live for A must eat sage in May. It was held that if a sage plant was planted by the house, it would keep noxious things away from the house, such as toads and witches. And it was also held that the sage plant would thrive or wither as the household prospered or failed. The wife rules when sage grows well in the garden is another saying. So when you see a garden with a happy sage, you know you're looking at a house with a happy wife. Sage is supposed to mitigate grief both in the heart and the mind. And Pepys, in his diary, says, "We observed a little churchyard between Gosport and Southampton, where it was customary to sow all of the graves with sage." Isn't that a lovely sight? And the weather there is milder, so their sage will probably overwinter quite easily. Sage helps the nerves, and by its powerful might, palsy is cured and fever put to flight. Gerard reminds us that sage is singularly good for the head and the brain, quickening the senses and the memory, strengthening the sinews, restoring health to those who have the palsy, and taking away shaky trembling of any part of the body. Sage can be used as a tea. Sage can be used as an infusion. Sage can be used as a tincture. Sage can be used as a vinegar. Sage can be used as a honey. These are the primary ways we're going to be using our aromatic mints in these primary ways. And each one of those ways gives us something special and useful. And let's just give us a few special words for sage. Sage is antihydrotic. In other words, it is against moisture. And its best known effect is indeed the reduction of perspiration, which can begin within 2 hours after taking sage tea or sage tincture, and can indeed last for several days. It's especially useful for those suffering from night sweats, and very, very well received by those dealing with tuberculosis. Sage tea has been used for a wide variety of nervous conditions, including trembling, depression, and it has uses as well for women, dysmenorrhea, amenorrhea, and to help with fertility. Again, we are seeing that sage and the volatile oils of sage gives us classic ideas about how to use it, warming and drying, but very, very, very drying when it comes to sage, more so than rosemary, and perhaps even more warming than the rosemary is as well. I personally really rely on sage to keep me healthy throughout the winter. Remember that both rosemary and sage can be used to counter colds and flus. I also mentioned that rosemary was a wonderful tonic for the scalp and the hair, and sage is also. As a matter of fact, I was told that if I wanted to use an herb as a natural coloring for the hair, I should simply make a very, very strong infusion of sage, using instead of 1 ounce to a quart, 2 ounces of dried sage leaf to a quart of boiling water, letting it steep overnight, and then pouring that over my head, rubbing it in, and not rinsing it out. It is true that both rosemary and sage bring a beautiful dark luster to the hair. The marvelous, magical, aromatic mints are going to take us in to some very exciting places. Next month, we're going to be looking at ground ivy, heal-all, thyme, and lavender, 1 non-scented mint and 3 scented mints. Remember that herbal medicine is people's medicine. It's the medicine that grows right outside your door, or that you can grow very easily in a pot of sage or a pot of rosemary. Thank you so much for giving me this time, Gemini.
Thank you, Susan. This
Green
concludes.
blessings, everyone.
Oh, thank you. This concludes part 4 of our 20-part series, Marvelous Mints with the Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio.